Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So last week, President Biden issued a sweeping executive order on environmental justice, which got a lot of people talking. People celebrating the executive order and what it means and what it's going to do to revolutionize the way that environmental justice is sought after in this country. And I'm seeing some skepticism about what it can really do and what it can really accomplish. There's just a lot of energy around this executive order. And so we are going to talk about that today. We need to talk about what's in the executive order that Biden just issued. But more importantly, we need to talk about executive orders in general, just to make sure we have the right amount of excitement when we think about what this means for environmental justice. Just the right amount. So let's talk about it. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. So last week, April 21st to be exact, President Biden signed an executive order that will, quote, revitalize our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. And just from reading the executive order, going through it, it's clear that the goal that he set out was to affirm that environmental justice is central to the implementation of civil rights and environmental laws. That was from the executive order. In other words, justice is at the center of how this administration seeks to protect the environment. I like how that sounds. And there is a whole lot in this executive order, a whole lot that he put into this particular executive order. So I went through it, I read it, and I'll just be honest with you. When I first read it and I was going through it, I was thinking, a lot of this stuff should already be done. I don't know why it's in this order, right? Things like the executive order requires agencies to notify nearby communities in the event of a release of toxic substances from a federal facility. Well, of course, I would have assumed that we were already doing that. Maybe we weren't, or maybe it wasn't required, but now this order requires it. Wonderful. Here's another one. It requires agencies to hold a public meeting to share information on resulting health risks and necessary precautions. Yes, we should be doing that, and I thought we already were, but I guess I was wrong. So this executive order puts that in writing. Do these things, agencies. Perfect. Another one. This executive order directs agencies to actively facilitate meaningful public participation and just treatment of all people in agency decision-making. Now, that's a nice statement, and I'm glad that Biden put that in the executive order. But to be honest, we need not just agencies to do that. We need private corporations and industries to do that also. Hopefully, there's a way to ensure that these polluters that are already there are also doing this as well. So when I read those things, I was thinking, well, I'm glad it's there. But you hope that that's already happening before this executive order goes out. That's what I'm thinking. And so I keep reading. Okay, good. We got some good, solid foundations to start on. And then there's some other interesting things in this executive order that I thought really stood out. So one, they're going to publish an environmental justice scorecard. So they're going to actually hold themselves accountable for how they're implementing these environmental justice ideas and themes into their everyday practice and grade themselves on how they're doing. I like the sound of that. Keep yourselves accountable, keep your agencies accountable, and continue to advance and do better and better as you continue to implement policies to protect the environment. And another good one that I saw was that they've developed guidance on elevating indigenous knowledge in federal research, policy, and decision making. It's been way past due to empower indigenous communities to actually have a say and have meaningful contributions and participation in how policies are enacted and developed that affect their communities. For so long, they've been just pushed off to the side while their land and their resources have been extracted, exploited, and polluted. And so I'm glad that there is guidance on how to incorporate what they know about the land because they've been protecting it and caring for it much longer than any of us have. and they can now have an opportunity to shape the policies that go into managing and protecting their resources. And so there's a link in the description to that guidance. I would encourage you to take a look at it because it's really important to see how, in fact, we can bridge that gap and bring in that knowledge to help things get better. And so those first few things, it's a nice executive order. I like what I'm reading. I'm liking what I'm seeing. But there's a couple of things I want to really specifically talk about because I think they're very important. And I think it gets to the heart of why I think this could be an effective executive order. So the first thing they do that I think is really significant is that they establish a White House Office of Environmental Justice. So if you remember last year in October, the EPA combined their Office of Environmental Justice with their Office of External Civil Rights into one big office. And that office was responsible for overseeing this large multi-billion-dollar grant program. They staffed this office, they got money, they're going to distribute, and they're off and running. And so now it's good to see that the White House will also have its own Office of Environmental Justice so we can actually collaborate and see how those entities work together to advance the cause for environmental justice across the country. And so now with this executive order, you have this office in the White House, which will be led by a chief environmental justice officer. And according to the executive order, this person will be tasked with coordinating the implementation of environmental justice policy across the federal government and ensuring that the federal government as a whole continues to learn and do more as it relates to environmental justice initiatives and dealing with the issues that these communities are facing. And so I think that's a really important move because now we're adding real infrastructure to advancing environmental justice. We're not just tossing money here or there, but we're actually having real on the ground resources and people and structure built up in order to deal with all the environmental justice issues that we're seeing in the country. So it's a big deal, in my opinion, to have an actual office with an actual chief officer with actual responsibilities and authority. And so, I do have some questions, obviously, about it. For instance, we know it's not a cabinet position. It's not that high level. But who does this person report to? Who are they accountable to in terms of making sure that the mission is being advanced as they work in this office? And what kind of resources does this office have? That was missing from the executive order. So I'm reading it and I'm thinking, well, this is great. We have this office. We have this person staffing it. We have a lot going on, but we don't have any information about this officer's staff. Does this person have support? How much money is available to do this work? But you got to start somewhere. And so I think this is a step in the right direction. I think this is a good move to show and to demonstrate that they're serious about tackling environmental justice issues throughout the country. So I applaud that office being established through this executive order. And so the second thing that stood out to me was the establishment of a new environmental justice subcommittee inside of the Office of Science and Technology. And so the reason I think that's really important is because this office is responsible for all of the research and data analysis and all the things that help shape our understanding of the issues related to environmental justice. And now, with this subcommittee that's committed solely to environmental justice, there's going to be coordination between existing data that we can collect and understanding the gaps in the research needs to get a better understanding of what's happening in these communities. Because there are so many gaps in the research. Cumulative impacts, the issues related to climate change, industrial pollution, decades of discrimination and racism, all of those things are just not well understood as far as how it impacts people living in these types of communities. And so I think having this kind of subcommittee and having an opportunity to directly address those gaps will really be beneficial. And also there's a big gaping hole in our understanding of environmental justice in rural parts of the country. Most of what we talk about and what we see and what we read about is in large cities, it's large industrial corridors, it's really condensed, highly populated areas. But what about the rural parts of the country? What about the things that they're dealing with? I don't know if there's much information about that, right? We talk about things like heat waves and droughts, and flooding and things of that nature. But what about in the rural areas where you have agricultural issues related to pesticide use and herbicides and, large animal feeding operations way out in the rural parts of different states and cities? And what about all of the mining and all of the extractive operations that take place in some of these rural communities? We don't talk about that. We don't see much research on that, and we don't really have a good handle on what's going on out there in those areas. And so we have to remember they're also dealing with significant environmental burdens and assaults on their land and on their well-being. So we have to bridge these research gaps and understand this better. And I think this type of a subcommittee can do that if it's well resourced and funded. And so those two things are really important in my mind because they represent true infrastructure that can actually make gains on what we can do and what we understand about what's happening, as opposed to just saying, I'm going to allocate money here. I'm going to reaffirm our commitment there. I'm going to prioritize this. I'm going to direct my agency to do that. Those kind of things, they sound nice and they're very good to bring to our attention. But these types of offices and committees and people and resources with specific goals and missions are really the kinds of things that can make a big, big difference. And so I'm excited about that. Hopefully it'll be done in a way that really does bring about change in communities all across the country. Now, with that being said, executive orders do have limits. There are limitations associated with executive orders that we have to deal with. We have to talk about what an executive order is and what it isn't, because it's not all things. It's not what a lot of people think it is. And so let's just talk about what it is. So an executive order is a directive to the executive branch that communicates its priorities and it allocates resources to further those priorities. So in this case, for this executive order, environmental justice is a priority, right? And so now we have directives, we have assertions about what we're trying to accomplish, what we're going to do. It's kind of like having a family meeting, right? So you have people working out here, people doing different things. You call a meeting, we all come together. This executive order outlines what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and then we go and do it. And so it's helpful for us, right, to see what the president thinks is a priority and what he's going to do and how he's going to corral his executive branch to accomplish all these things that he set out to do. And of course, it lets us know that he's listening, right? So he's listening to the groups, he's listening to the communities, he's listening to the activists, the advocates, the people who have been saying for decades and decades and decades that this is a problem. He's listening and doing his best to respond. And so we can appreciate that. I appreciate that. It's a good thing that he's doing that. And we want all of our leadership to listen to the people and respond accordingly with whatever tools they have at their disposal. And so this order is just a tool to assist in advancing all those priorities. But an executive order is not legislation. So it's not a bill that becomes a law, and it's not a directive that becomes enshrined in our legislative record, right? Because we have separation. We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And so the legislative branch, right, the Congress, the House, the Senate, they make the bills and pass the laws. They're the ones who appropriate funding to allow for those laws to be done. And the executive branch ensures that those laws are executed. And then, of course, if there's an issue, a dispute, the judicial branch takes care of dealing with whatever the concerns are. The Supreme Court rules ultimately on what's constitutional and what's not. And that's how we have our separation in our government. And so executive order, he states what he wants to do. He has the money that he's already been given to do it. And he's trying to get the people that work for him to get those things done. And he's establishing offices and committees. And that's great. But here's the problem. Because it's not a law, and because you need Congress to pass laws to make sure these things stay the way they are, a couple things can happen. One, since Congress controls the money, they could just reduce funding. They can take funding away from departments, away from certain agencies, and make it difficult for a president to do what they want to do in those agencies. Without the proper funding, you can't get things done. So that could happen. The second thing is the next president can just stop doing what the order says. They can just say, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. We're moving on to something else. We got other priorities. We're not going to spend our time, our energy, our resources, our money on this environmental justice stuff. That's not us. And then he could just, whoever the president is, can undo this executive order with the next executive order. Which is why when you try to govern and you try to operate by executive order, you're always at a disadvantage because you don't know how long or how much of that work can actually get done, because there's no laws backing you up as you do it. And there's no legislative action around what you're trying to put into place. And so it can be easily pulled back from you. This happens a lot. It happens all the time because in many instances, Congress and the president are different political parties, different priorities. And so because of that discrepancy, the president can't get things done. The Congress doesn't have what they want. And now you find a lot of presidents, particularly in recent memory, trying to do it so much through executive order. Order after order after order. So many executive orders to try to get things done and try to move things in certain directions. And it gets undone when the next person comes into office. And look, we've been here before with these executive orders, right? So I don't know if you're aware of this, but in 1994, President Bill Clinton issued the first executive order on environmental justice, right? It was called Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. And the language is very similar to this one, right? It said each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of the mission by identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, activities, and policies on minority populations and low-income populations. Basically saying environmental justice is going to be a priority, and we are going to look at our agencies to make sure they're operating in ways that don't disproportionately impact low-income and minority communities. That's what he was saying. And he had a timeline in there to develop a strategy to address environmental injustice. And he had in there a big report he wanted to get from a working group to figure out what to do about the issues that were brought to his attention. And all of that was in the executive order. And I'm sure he had the idea that I put this order out, I'm going to get this report back that tells me what to do. And I'm going to take this report to Congress and say we need to pass some laws to address environmental justice and all the issues based off this report that I got from my executive order. But guess what? It never happened. I can't even find the report. I looked online for hours and hours. I don't know where this report is. No laws were passed. Nothing changed. Nothing happened. No movement toward environmental justice. It was a nice executive order, but nothing. And so here we are again, right? We have a new executive order on environmental justice. We have what appears to be an administration committed to environmental justice. We have new offices being developed. We have an EPA that seems to be more in tune with the communities dealing with environmental injustice. And we have what appears to be some momentum towards real change and real action. But what you really need is a law, a bill to be passed. We need something that is enshrined, that is voted on, that is signed into law by the president, that actually codifies these changes and these priorities and these concerns. And so right now, there's a bill out there. I don't know if you've seen it. It is the Environmental Justice for All Act of 2023. They keep reintroducing it year after year after year. 2021, 2022, now it's 2023. And we could spend a whole episode talking about it. But basically, it's trying to put into law what this executive order has in it already, so it can't be undone in the future. That's what it's trying to do. And that's what we actually need right now. We need a bill to be passed. We need real legislation that actually makes a push for environmental justice the law of the land, not just a priority for the current president. Look, I don't want to dampen anybody's excitement. I don't want anybody to get down about the idea that it's just an executive order, because I think it is important and it is noteworthy that this executive order went out and that there is significant energy around environmental justice. But without legislative action, without passing a law, all this energy, all of this can be undone easily, quickly, and nobody wants any of that. We don't want this to be undone once we're finally getting going and seeing some movement and some changes. So I applaud the administration for the executive order on environmental justice and the commitment to righting these wrongs that have been so pervasive and so difficult to address with the current political climate and the current state of things. But I want that law to get passed. I want legislation on the books. And I want all of us to be confident that no matter who's president moving forward, no matter what that president's priorities are, that there is a bill that enshrines our commitment to environmental justice. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I want to see. Let's ensure that environmental justice continues from now to the next generation and into the future, as long as it takes to right the wrongs of the past and to provide help and healing and hope to all these communities that have been suffering and dealing with these issues for so long without any aid, without any support at all. Let's go for that. Then I'll be really excited. Really, really excited. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. Let me just take this time out to really thank all of you for supporting and listening to the podcast. I appreciate it so much. I'm looking at the statistics and the numbers keep going up and up and up. Thank you so much. Special shout out to Environista. She sent me a message on Instagram, said she liked the show. She is the network manager of the National Black Environmental Justice Network. They do amazing work. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the podcast. Continue to share it with whoever you want to share it with. Thank you for the support. We love you and see you next time.